The following is brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network.
It's time to get in the ring with DJ D.
Yes, it is. It's time to get in the ring with DJ D. Kooks. Danny Kukler here. And I have a very special guest with me. He is a great wrestling historian. He has the great Crowbar Press Archives Facebook page and Twitter page on the internet, the great interwebs, where he posts great wrestling news clippings and great resources. He is Scott Teal. Scott, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing just great, Danny. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Yes, I'm doing a lot more wrestling history pieces since everything hit the fan, and I don't really want to review empty arena wrestling, even though it's weird. It's really weird right now.
I don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. In fact, I really haven't looked. I don't think I've watched maybe 3 or 4 wrestling shows since around 1981, 82, something like that.
Wow, that is really interesting. But how did you get started in the wrestling business?
Well, I was at a girlfriend's house in 1968, and she invited me over to have dinner with her family. I was, I guess I would have been about 9th grade then. And then she invited me over to lunch, and we're at the dinner table. I knew nothing about wrestling. I think I had seen one clip of wrestling, and best I can remember, it was a guy named Sailor Art Thomas. Man, this guy was built like you wouldn't believe. And he did this thing where they played the drums and his chest muscles would bounce up and down. It was really cool. That's all I remember about wrestling. But anyways, I go over to this girl's house.
Wasn't Sailor Art Thomas an African-American wrestler?
Yes, sure was. Sure was. He was probably had the best body of any pro wrestler ever at that time. I wouldn't say, I'd say ever. He was absolutely built like nothing you had ever seen before. It was just incredible.
Yes. But continue on. I just wanted to ask that question.
So anyways, we're eating lunch, and I guess we started about 1:45. And 1 o'clock, everybody just gets up from the table, takes their dishes in another room, and disappears. And I looked over at the girl I was with, and I said, where'd everybody go? And she says, oh, we're all going in to watch wrestling. And I said, wrestling? And she says, yeah, come on. So we went in the living room and sat down, and of course, I knew nothing what was going on. And man, what I saw absolutely captivated me. And I was hooked from then on. I didn't miss a show. In fact, they showed pro wrestling on Saturday, I want to say Saturday night, like at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. And then they repeated the show on another station on Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. And from that point on, I watched the show twice every week. As long as I was in Florida, I never missed it.
So you're originally from Florida?
Yep, and that's where I grew up, in a small town called well, it's not so small anymore, but it's called Bradenton, just south of Tampa.
Wow. So you were watching championship wrestling from Florida with Gordon Soley.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The first show I saw, Gordon, of course, was commentating, and they had the great Malenko and Hans Mortier. But the thing I remember that really hooked me was Jose Lothario. Actually, I believe it was Wahoo McDaniel came out holding Jose Lothario, like holding him up. And Lothario, no, it must have been Joe Scarpa. Anyway, Joe Scarpa was all bloodied up, and they were helping him out to talk to Gordon, and he was crying. He said he was talking to the Gladiator, who was Ricky Hunter, was a masked wrestler at the time, a big superstar down there during those days. And what had happened is the fans had taken up a collection at one of the shows and bought Ricky a wristwatch. And the storyline goes that Joe Scarpa caught Malenko and Mortier in the dressing room taking the watch out of Ricky's, the Gladiator's locker, and they were going to break it. So Joe was crying, going on stage. He's going, I tried to stop them. I couldn't stop them. They got the watch. And I'm telling you, you talk about soap opera. It was fantastic. And I didn't miss it from then on. Like I said, I was hooked from that point on. And I watched championship wrestling from Florida for the next 6 years. And that was before I moved to 6 years later is when I moved to Tennessee.
And then did you find out about Tennessee wrestling?
Well, before that, I discovered a couple months after I discovered pro wrestling, I discovered magazines. I was a big comic book fan, and every week I'd go to the drugstore and I'd buy every single comic book that came out.
Right.
And while I was there, they have a big selection of magazines, and I noticed one day they had a magazine called Wrestling World. So I picked it up and took it home, and that was the greatest thing ever, wrestling magazines. I read wrestling magazines, every one that came out I bought, just like watching the TV show. And then one day I got it up, I think it was 1970. I thought, you know what, there's not a whole lot of coverage on Florida in these magazines. It sort of bothered me, and everything was about Bruno and New York and California. And so one day I wrote a letter and I talked about the great wrestling in Florida, how great it was, and that I wish they'd had more coverage about, in the magazines. And this was Wrestling Review that I wrote to. And sure enough, another month or so goes by, and here's my letter actually published in the magazon. So that was my first. Yeah, that was my first published piece in a wrestling magazine. You talk about excited. That was so cool. And I don't even know where I got the idea, but I met a guy named Kowatiki. He was a wrestler, underneath wrestler there in Florida, and he was he worked later on for Ann Gunkel up in Georgia. I met him. We became good friends. He was training a guy named Bill Dexter, and Bill and I became good friends, and we all hung out together quite often. And somehow, I don't even remember, it's been so long ago, but I got the idea of taking pictures at the matches. So I bought a nice camera, a Mamiya Secor, and 35 millimeter, and is that right? I guess it's 35 millimeter. I can't remember what it was. We don't use film anymore.
No, we don't. Sure don't.
Yeah. So, but I got a nice camera, and I started going to the matches, and I started to learn about matches being held in some of the small towns in Florida, Arcadia, Winter Haven. I never went to Lakeland, but Fort Myers, Wauchula, a lot of the tiny little towns around Bradenton had pro wrestling. In fact, they even came to Bradenton one time, and I'll never forget sitting in the bleachers there. I don't think the bleachers were 5 feet from the ring. They didn't even have ringside on one side of the ring. The building was so small. It was an old armory. But anyway, I started taking pictures, and I learned that if you carry a bag that looked like a wrestler's bag with my camera stuff in it, I could walk up to the door and just sort of nod at the guy taking tickets, say I'm here to take pictures, and they just usher me in, so I didn't have to pay, which that was so cool. I didn't have anything to do with the wrestling office, but I wanted to take pictures, and I started writing for the magazines and sending magazines into some of the magazines like Big Book of Wrestling, Wrestling Guide, and I actually got paid $25 every time I sent in an article with pictures. And so that was pretty much how I got my start in pro wrestling, just freelancing articles for national magazines. I never had anything to do with the actual promotion in Florida. I never met, other than just, when I was first became a fan, I went up and I'd get autographs from Eddie Graham, Briscoe, and a lot of those guys, but I never actually met them and, sat down and talked to them or got to know them on a first name basis or anything. But anyway, the magazines, that was really kicked off my start. Sometime around, it was in 1972, I started publishing a newsletter called the Tampa scene. And inside that newsletter, I printed information about what was going on in the world of wrestling in Tampa, the results, every match that happened, both television and the house shows, little things about what happened on TV. And in the national magazines, they had what they called fan club corners, and they would list people's name and their address, and they say, so-and-so is looking for pen pals from Texas or pen pals from Pennsylvania. So-and-so has a bulletin called California Wrestling Report. So anyway, I sent in the information to the magazine, and sure enough, they put that little ad in there, and it was in there every month. Scott Teal has the Tampa scene for sale, 25 cents. Write him at this address. And I started getting orders from everywhere. It was really cool. And after a few months, I changed the name to Florida Fanfare because I had learned that there was wrestling in places other than Tampa. When you're a wrestling fan back then, if you're just a real casual fan, you don't realize they have wrestling in Tampa on Tuesday, Miami Wednesday, Jacksonville on Thursday, Tallahassee Friday, Orlando Monday. You think it's just in Tampa. And when I learned there was wrestling in other towns every day of the week, I thought that was the coolest thing. So I started publishing the results in that newsletter, and subsequently changed it from the Tampa scene to Florida Fanfare because it covered the whole state.
Right. And, how would you get these results? Would you actually go to the matches, or would somebody phone you in on the results? Would you have
some of it at the drugstore. When I go down to the drugstore every week, they had newspapers from St. Petersburg, Miami, Orlando, and I'd just leaf through the magazines and write down the results, or I'd go to the library. The library carried a few of those newspapers from out in the state. So I'd go to the library and write down the results. I can't really remember how I got some of the smaller shows, like I said, like Winter Haven, Florida, or Arcadia, unless I just somehow found out about it. Sometimes on the Championship Wrestling from Florida TV program, they would say, we're going to have wrestling this Saturday night in Wauchula. And I'd go to those shows, and while I was there taking pictures, I'd write down the results of the matches. But I had pen pals too from all parts of the state. People in Miami would send me results and programs. I had a guy in Orlando. In fact, the guy in Orlando, I wish I knew where he was. We corresponded for 5-6 months. He used to send me the Orlando program, and I would send him the program from Tampa. And that was my first really correspondent in Florida. But that's pretty much how I got those results. And during that same time, I was corresponding with people all over the United States, people in Texas. One of the guys, Jim Lancaster, he wrestled in later years, but he was just a fan at the time. He lived in Dayton, Ohio, and he used to send me, nice write-ups on the matches in Dayton, Ohio. And Jim's probably one of my oldest friends as far as wrestling correspondence go back in those days. And fortunately, we had the opportunity to meet when he came into Tennessee years later and make a few towns together. And so since then, we've become friends, and we stay in touch fairly regularly.
I was about to ask, any notable people you've corresponded with, and you said Jim Lancaster. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it was cool that he went on to have a career in pro wrestling, and he came to Tennessee. I don't remember. I guess I realized he was coming to Tennessee. I used to go to the office, the wrestling office, when they finished booking the cards for the week to find out who was wrestling in the town, so I could do do the lineups for my Slamagram arena programs. And he was coming through there one time, and I don't know how we got in touch with each other. I may have just gone to the matches and saw him there, and we ended up making a couple trips to a couple small spot shows. He was managing the Bounty Hunters at the time. That was before Jimmy Kent came along. And I remember we went to Columbia. The Bounty Hunters were wrestling the McGuire twins. I don't know if you're familiar with the McGuires. They were big guys, sort of a Haystack Calhoun type characters, but they're probably the heaviest pro wrestlers, in the history of the sport, pretty much.
How big were they?
Oh, 500-600 pounds, I think. And that wasn't just hype, they were pretty much legitimate, really heavy guys. They were huge. Yeah. They weren't necessarily tall as they were, wide. I guess
that's actually really funny. So anything else you recount from Florida?
Yeah, a couple interesting stories. When I was doing my newsletter, I found a guy in Tampa who owned a newsstand in Tampa, and a friend of mine that was helping me with the newsletter that lived in Tampa, his name was James Brown. And James found this guy and talked the guy into putting my newsletter on his newsstand. So the guy sold my Tampa Scene newsletter and Florida Fanfare later on his newsstand. I didn't learn about it until later, but Eddie Graham apparently saw a copy of it, or somebody saw it and gave him a copy. But apparently Eddie was not happy whatsoever with it. It wasn't that I said it. It wasn't an expose. Well, it wasn't an expose as the type of expose you think of as like became the Wrestling Observer newsletter, where they told what was happening behind the scenes. Mine was strictly results and who beat who attacked who on television, what the feuds were. But the expose part of it was it let people in Miami Beach realize there was wrestling in Tampa, and a lot of times the guys wrestled the same guy in Tampa that they did in Miami Beach. And likewise, people in Jacksonville. People in Tampa all of a sudden they say, hey, this...
Happy that
no.
People
they didn't want fans
together.
Yes. They didn't want fans to know that kind of stuff. That Jack Briscoe wrestles Paul Jones in Tampa. Well, he also wrestled him on Wednesday night in Miami, Thursday night in Jacksonville, and then they may have been in either Fort Lauderdale or Tallahassee on Friday. It was sort of as an expose on the business that why would these guys wrestle every single night of the week? So I heard Eddie wasn't real happy about it, but I never got any pushback from it in any of the shows. When I went to Tampa, I took pictures a few times, not a whole lot. Usually I took pictures at the spot shows. I didn't want to, I guess you say, impose myself too much, get in the way of anything, especially in a big venue like Tampa. Small spot shows, I didn't, I wasn't as inhibited about doing about going up to the ring and leaning up, taking pictures and all that. But I was sort of, I didn't like doing it in Tampa as much. I took a lot of pictures in Sarasota, which really is where I took most of my pictures. Bradenton is just the next town up from Sarasota. So I went there every time they had wrestling, which was usually once a month, once every other week.
That's really interesting. So where did they run in Tampa?
Fort Homer Hesterly Armory.
And how much?
It's an old building. They'd been running there since at least the 30s, I guess 1930s. They'd been running in that building.
And how many people did that hold?
Oh boy, I'd have to say maybe 4,000 to 5,000. And they packed it out. I mean, I know, you hear guys all the time tell their story, and it's always, we packed it. We sold out every show we were on, and that's not the case. But they packed out Fort Homer Hesterly Armory more times than they didn't.
Very cool, very cool. So you moved to Tennessee.
Uh-huh.
And what were the differences between the Tennessee wrestling and the Florida wrestling that you noticed?
Oh, it was night and day. Florida was mat wrestling. I mean, those guys, even the heels, man, they could go. They could wrestle. It was very strictly competitive style pro wrestling. They get in there and you'd believe that they were really going at it, trying to wrestle each other. I mean, they do their dirty stuff. The heels would do their dirty moves and pulling hair and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it was wrestling. When I came to Tennessee, it was a completely different animal. I mean, it was punch, kick, a lot of comedy. It was just something totally different from what I was used to. I didn't mind it, but it was hard at first to get used to it. Although I didn't come to the matches all that much in Tennessee for the first year. I went a few times to take pictures of a few of the guys I knew when they'd come through I'd just go once in a while to take some pictures for one of the magazines. and got to know a few of the guys that were there. At the time, I was going to Trevecca Nazarene College, majoring in music. And so I was pretty busy at school, but like I said, I did go to the matches when I had an opportunity.
Right, you were a music major?
Yeah, sure was. I played my major was music education, and I got my minor in trumpet performance.
So you were a music teacher. My brother's a music teacher.
Well, that's what I planned to do, but as things turned out, I met my wife, future wife, at Trevecca. I was in my last year there, and she was in her first year. So when I graduated, I thought, we got married shortly after I graduated, and we decided that I'd just stay. I was working for UPS part-time, United Parcel Service, and
right.
I thought, well, I'll just keep working for UPS, and then when she graduates in 3 years, and I can decide where we're going. We can decide where we're going to go, if I want to teach, what school I want to teach at, try and find a school to teach at, where we want to live. But as it turned out, I got on it with UPS full time, and it was a great job. I thought, I'm just going to hang with this, and I'm so glad I did, because it gave me a great living, and now I've got a great retirement and enjoying my
great benefits too.
What's that?
Great benefits too.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. So yeah, that was the best decision I ever made. It sure was.
I didn't know that. So my brother's a music teacher at a Catholic high school in the Philadelphia area. So.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I didn't miss it. I mean, I love music still, and we go to the symphony and musicals and things like that still, But I guess if I don't know that I really would have enjoyed teaching all that much, to be honest. I didn't enjoy my student teaching, and I definitely didn't like marching band, which is, that would have been part of what I had to do. I loved more the performance, the symphony, playing in the orchestra or directing the orchestra. I enjoyed that kind of thing, but I didn't care for a lot of the other, like I said, like the marching band, that type of thing.
Right. That's very interesting because my brother enjoys both aspects. So
right, good.
I caught on to that. I had to ask you about that because actually it goes along with my story as well, because my brother's in music education.
Good.
And my sister's a music education major as well.
Right. Wow, you got music in your family.
So it's very much in my family.
Good.
So, what? So it was very punch kick. The Tennessee style wrestling. It took you a while to get used to, but once you got used to it, did you fall in love?
Oh, I'd always been in love with pro wrestling, whether it was wrestling or whether it was punch and kick. It didn't bother me. I just loved being around it. And probably, I think the thing that attracted me most, and I'm talking about from the very beginning, when I first discovered pro wrestling, it wasn't necessarily the wrestling, although I love that. I love the competition aspect of it. But it was more from day one. In the back of my mind, I kept thinking, because I had friends at school when I first discovered it. I got talking about it, and they say, all that stuff fake, don't you? And I'd say, oh yeah, I know it, but that didn't matter to me. It was so cool. But what fascinated me the most was, all I could think was, how do they do this? Who is it that tells these guys to win or who has to lose? How do they determine how they do this? How are these matches laid out? Who's running things behind the scenes? It was the background information I wanted to know. That's just something that just intrigued me. And that's really, I would say, more than the wrestling. That is what carried me through the years to the point where I am today. I mean, I always wanted to know more. And that's really why I started writing my books in 1990 or magazines in 1996. I wanted to know more about it. And I knew everything about it, but not knew everything, but I had been in the business. So I was smart to the business for all those years. So it wasn't like I was wanting to learn anything, but I was wanting to learn more about the wrestlers' careers by 1996 and letting other people know what the wrestling business, how the wrestling business really worked, because it was already exposed. The Observer had been around quite a while.
Right.
You know, people knew what was what. So I wanted to have these wrestlers tell their stories in their words, you know, so that people can understand how the wrestling business worked, what happened behind the scenes with, you know, with whoever, you know, I was writing about.
Was there a resilience at first with some of these wrestlers, like maybe like a Jody Hamilton or like a Soley?
Not at first, not with me. The whole reason is when I went to work in 1976 for Nick Goulas, the promoter here, he accepted me, I mean, open arms. He told me, you know, Scott, he says, I want you to do publicity for me, pictures. He said, I think you'll do a good job for me. He says, and what he did is he asked me to ride with him one night. Shortly after he asked me to come work for him, he called and he says, would you ride to Chattanooga with me? I said, well, sure. Man, you talk about feeling, made me feel how good that made me feel to have the promoter ask me to ride, you know, make a trip with him. And on the way down there, you know, he knew I was smart to the business, but he gave me what I like to term the wrestling facts of life. And he said, Scott, he says, when you come and work for me, he says, you've got the run of whatever you want to do. He says, I like your work. He says, you can go in and out of the dressing room. He says, you're one of the boys. I mean, that's what he told me. He says, you're one of the boys. But he says, one thing, please remember, he says, never tell anyone else about what goes on behind the doors of pro wrestling, in the dressing room, in the office. He says, all that is kayfabe. He says, you don't. And I said, thank you. I said, that's absolutely the way I'll be. I said, I've never exposed the business to anybody. I said, even when I was just a fan, before I knew anything about the business, I never shared that kind of stuff with anybody. When I learned, and a lot of the stuff I learned was through osmosis from being around the boys, you know, until I actually got in the business. But I learned a lot of it before then. And so it was pretty cool, but that's really the thing that stands out the most about that earliest time in the business was making that trip with Nick and him reading me the wrestling facts of life.
Yeah, and that must have been amazing to be on that trip with Nick Goulas. What were your first impression of Nick?
Oh, I love Nick. He was great. He always treated me nice. He always treated me well. I had heard the stories, you know, the guys talking about what a cheapskate he was and he cheated people. And yeah, he did a lot of that, I'm sure. You know, but then again, as I got older and understood more about the business, Nick Goulas was making $15 and $25 payoffs in 1969, 1970, 1972, 3. But then again, Jerry Jarrett was making $50 payoffs in 1980, 81, and that wasn't much better than $25 back in 1970.
No, it wasn't.
And the wrestlers will tell you the same thing. You know, they all, no matter who it is, you know, who's promoting, most of the wrestlers will say, he was a thief, he stole, and he did this, he did that. And I've heard it about pretty much every promoter in the world. You know, there's a few, you know, you don't hear as many bad things about it. Paul Bosch, for one, John Owen up in Portland. Yeah, you know, you don't hear much bad about them, but there are guys, man, I've heard guys rip both of them unmercifully for things they did, you know. So, but it's just, you know, your perspective and, you know, just a personal situation they had with that, you know, with those promoters. But Nick was great to me. He treated me, I mean, just almost like a son. He really did.
I'm looking at some of your titles, man. You've written books with a who's who. Taz.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things you asked, that's right, and I didn't finish it really, about whether the guys were reluctant. The first stuff I did was actually a newsletter called Whatever Happened To, and that was in 1996. And that's when I started doing the interviews with the guys, and they would actually really open up with me about their careers. You know, they didn't hold anything back. The first 5 issues of whatever happened to, there was pretty kayfabe, because I had no intent, even though the Observer was a big thing by then, I had no intent to expose the business to anybody through a printed newsletter. And so they were sort of kayfabe, just letting people know what happened to these different wrestlers, that had disappeared over the years. And as time went by over those first few issues, the wrestlers were telling me, they say, you need to go ahead and tell more of the story. Tell the story like it was. Don't worry about exposing anything, because everything's already exposed. And so I came around. Granted, there were guys that, still had a problem with certain subjects, or telling certain parts of the business. I guess the one most frequently came up, and I've only had a few that didn't want to talk about it, would be about the use of the blade. You mentioned Ole was an open book. JJ was an open book. Jody Hamilton was an open book to a point. Jody didn't really want to come right out and use much technical wrestling jargon, kayfabe, carny type language. But he did, and in fact, something he told me one story, and there was he didn't want to talk too much about the blade either, if I remember right. And there was one story he told me, and it was sort of like one of those stories, like he had told me there's some things he didn't want to talk about in the book. But one of these stories, either I did it on purpose or didn't even think about it, and it went through. I published it in the book, and after the book came out, Jody emailed me, and of course we were just learning email at the time, and he says, "I want to thank you so much." And this is just sort of what I remember him saying is, "I want to thank you. The book is really good. You covered everything in such detail. I think it's so great, but you talked about this, and when I see you, I'm gonna rip your head off." I mean, he was saying it in jest, but I thought that was pretty funny. But other than that, no. Most of the guys were open books, except, like I said, just a handful who wouldn't talk about certain things like blading.
Like, why is blading such a touchy subject?
Well, I think the use of the blade was one of the last things really exposed. I mean, it had been exposed back, 2020, and with Eddie Mansfield and, things. I mean, Roy Shire, they had all talked about the blade. In fact, the blade had been talked about in the 50s and 60s in newspaper articles. But it was something the guys just felt was more sacrosanct than any other subjects, like working a match or things like that. I think it was just something that went a little deeper than what most fans knew about pro wrestling, even if they knew a little bit of something. And it was sort of like the last bastion of kayfabe, and the wrestlers, I think, were just a little bit. Some of the wrestlers were just a little bit wary about going into that territory.
Yeah, and it's like a psychological thing. Like, why would you hurt yourself in that?
Yeah.
Area? So I sort of get it too. Like, why would you cut yourself in your head? I don't know, Red means green is what they say. Red means green. Talk about your experience with Stan Hansen. That must have been really cool, writing a book with him.
Yeah, that was pretty neat. It's funny, but a lot of these books, several of the books, I guess I should say, really stemmed from the book I did with Ole Anderson, my first actual book,
right?
First full-length book, because it was right when we were in Charlotte. I mean, we had a line backed up from our table for 3 full days. I mean, it never let up. We signed books. We sold every book we took. And we took like 10 cartons, like 25 books. We sold like 250 books. But that line never let up. And during that weekend, both JJ and Ivan Koloff came up and asked me if I'd be interested in writing their books. Of course, I was, man, that would just meant so much to me, because they were both, to me, huge names in the business. Those are guys I really, really could respect based on what, their accomplishments. So it was nice to have somebody like that come up. And then a few years later, Stan Stan had pretty much gotten out of the business, and that's why he decided to write a book. He didn't want to write one, before that, because he didn't want to. He was still very kayfabe. I mean, up to the very end, and into writing the book. He's another one that did not want to write about the Blade, and it was a little bit of push and pull at times with Stan, not much, but just occasional things I'd ask him, and he'd like, oh boy, I don't know if I want to talk about that. He was still in that 70s mindset, and I was too, still for the most part. But I realized that the information was out there. The business had been exposed, and nothing that I got or asked the wrestlers was going to expose anything more than what was already being told. And my thought was, if the story is going to be told and people are going to expose the business, then I want the people to expose the business, or the people who were in the business, who knew the business and understood the business, rather than people who weren't in the business thinking they know something, telling all these stories about, oh, they did this, they did that, because so many times they don't really know all that much they're talking about. So that was my thinking, get the guys telling the stories themselves, so it came directly from the horse's mouth. Stan was great to work for. I mean, he sent me, a great manuscript, and of course we worked on it. I sent him like 100 some pages of questions based on his manuscript, and we ended up with twice of what he originally sent me. So he was real good to work for, and what a nice guy. One thing I learned about Stan, and I've learned this in a lot of different cases, Stan as a wrestler was one of the most hated men. He was absolutely crazy, wild, arrogant, you name it. But as a person, he is a real person in the world. He is one of the most meek, nice, what word am I looking for? Humble men, I think, that I've ever met in the wrestling business. He doesn't believe his own hype. He is just shy, somewhat shy as far as I'm concerned. We were at the Gulf Coast Wrestlers reunion one year, and Stan was there. And I at the time I was emceeing their show. I was doing magic and comedy between all the variety acts they had. And I asked Stan, I said, Stan, I'm going to do a card trick, and I'd like you to come up here, and all I want you to do is come up, and I'm going to have you pick a card. And that's pretty much it. He hemmed and hawed. I don't know if I could get up and do that. Can you find somebody else? I'd rather not. Here's a guy, and I told the people that day when I got up there to do that trick, I said, I asked Stan Hansen to help me with this, but he was so bashful about it doing it. I said, here's a guy that has wrestled in Japan before tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in his underwear, and he was afraid to get up here and help me do a card trick. But that was the honest truth. He was so nervous about getting up there just in front of his peers, the other wrestlers, and helping me with a card trick that I just didn't. I said, don't worry about it. I'll find somebody else. But I always thought that was funny that Stan was, the big mean guy, rough guy he was, and he was afraid to get up in front of about 180 people.
Yeah, you wrote books with Rocky Johnson and and Tony Atlas too.
Yes.
And those books are fantastic.
Well, thank you. Oh, you got a copy of Rocky's before it was pulled off the shelf, huh?
No, I heard the great things about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because it didn't go, didn't last very long on the shelves because I don't know the whole story behind it, but it's problems the publisher had with that's the only book I didn't publish myself is the Rocky Johnson book, and the publisher had so many problems with Rocky that they decided to pull it. So it's a shame because it is a good book. I really enjoyed working on it.
Yeah, and you also wrote a book with Tony Atlas too.
Yep. Tony's a salt of the earth guy. I love Tony. He's just so nice, and we had a lot of fun working with his book, and I learned a lot of things I didn't know from talking with him, and a few things I wish I didn't know.
Yep.
But yeah, that was a lot of fun
too.
With who?
Jeff Bowdren being one.
Yes. Yeah, Jeff Bowdren, two books actually. One was based on a series of interviews that were done in, I want to say Fort Lauderdale, where a group of 6 fans, like Jeff and 4 or 5 other guys, would bring in a name wrestler, and they'd go to a restaurant, have dinner, and then they.
And then the other book is Bowdrum the Booker, which is reprints of his Bowdrum the Booker articles that he used to publish in the Observer way back in, I believe it was in the 90s.
Yeah, and the first book is Breaking Kayfabe, Dinner with Wrestling, Legends of Wrestling, which you would get different legends in. Sorry, I had to repeat that because you broke up a little bit there. But yes, but Jeff Bowdrum is a great friend of the show.
Good. Jeff's a great guy. I feel for him, what he's going through now. He's really going through a tough time with chemo and all the things he's going through. We just got to remember, keep him up in our prayers.
Keep him up in our prayers and keep fighting, Jeff. We love you, man.
Yep, we do.
I'm good friends with Barry Rose too, so.
Barry's great.
Barry lives up in my area, so.
Oh, okay. I never understood why he moved up there. I thought he'd always live in Florida.
Yeah, talk about some of your compiling books. How you put those together. Like you have the Alabama 1931 to 35, the history of the greatest wrestling ever, history of Nashville wrestling in the Garden, the complete history of Sam Munchak's Missouri State Championship book.
Yes. The Missouri State Championship book was written by Roger Deem. Roger had a love for St. Louis wrestling and the history of the Missouri State title belt. And that's what that book is about. It's a great history book, but it's got a lot of quotes and information that came directly from the pro wrestlers themselves that held the Missouri title and people who were with the St. Louis promotion. And then there's another compilation book by Vern May. It's the wrestling history of pro wrestling in Western Canada, and it's about the Stu Hart promotion, how he came to start his promotion, and all the results that took place, all the different, or not the results, but all the different little promotions that came into being in Canada. You're talking hundreds of promotions. It's amazing to read about them all. But the main books that I'm continuing now is my what I call the Great Wrestling Venues, and the first one was on Madison Square Garden, and I take people all the way back to the turn of the century when the first wrestling matches were held at the Garden, and all the way up through present day. Present day when I published the book. The second one, of course, was Nashville up through 1960. Eventually, I'll be getting back around to the second volume of the Nashville, which will take us from 1961 on up. And then Alabama, which is Jason Presley, 1931-35. Jason Presley is absolutely one of the top up-and-comer wrestling historians. I mean, he's at the top of the heap right now. He does just phenomenal work. If I have a question about a Southern guy, I don't know, and I have good resources here for information about the Southern, the guys that work down in the South. Man, I email him and he comes across just so quickly, with information on guys that I need. I have so much respect for him. And then the other one is the book on Japan with Haruo Yamaguchi, who spearheaded that one, and Koji Miyamoto. That was really cool because it's the Rikidozan years, how wrestling really got its start when it really took off in Japan. And it has results from every possible show you can think of for the years when Rikidozan was alive. And I had so much fun with that book. Right now, I'm working on several histories on the drawing board, and I haven't started. Well, I have started them. They're in some form of completion. I will be doing Tampa, Florida, St. Louis, but the ones that are coming out first will be Amarillo, which is going to be a 2-volume set.
Wow.
Great. And it's got all the matches from the early 1900s all the way from when the promotion was, when the last funk show, the big 40 years of funk or whatever they called it. And it has everything in it, from Dory Funk Sr.'s arrival in Amarillo, how he got hold of the promotion, all the Funks, all those great years in the 60s and the 70s of the Funks, and every single match.
Last one in 99.
What's that?
Till the last show in 99.
I think that's when it was. Yes, absolutely. But it has everything for all those years. It has it'll have program covers, articles from the newspaper, ads from the newspaper. That's Amarillo. And this week I've been working on Knoxville. There's a guy named Tim Dills in South Tennessee that actually wrote a ton on that, and he's researched most of the results. I've gone through and I'm adding a whole lot of stuff to it. I mean, a lot of information about George Kazana, the promoter, that I know that Tim didn't. But Tim has so much information, it's just unbelievable, about every single wrestler, especially in the 60s and 70s, 50s through the 70s, that came through Knoxville. We're going to have every card ever held in Knoxville that we could find, ads, newspaper articles. I just cannot wait. I'm up through 1948 right now, and it started in 1905, and it looks like it's going to be 2, maybe even 3 books. It's huge, and it'll go all the way up through the Fuller years and Blackjack Mulligan after that. So I have a lot on my plate.
Go up to Smoky Mountain.
Yep. We go through Smoky Mountain. Not real heavy on Smoky Mountain, because I think that's a book that really would best be done with Jim Cornette, but we do cover everything that happened with Smokey, in Knoxville.
Yes. So
yeah, Smokey will be a book of its own. I mean, whether I work on it or somebody else does, but I think Smoky Mountain Wrestling would be a phenomenal book. I'd love to collaborate with Jim on that one. In fact, that's something I was planning to contact him about, because I'd like that. That's something I'd really love to do.
Yes. That would be actually a really good book, or a really good shoot interview. Just Jim Cornette talking about all the Smoky Mountain stories.
Right, sure. Just go through every card and talk about how he came up with the idea for the card, the different matches, the highlight matches, the stipulations, all that kind of stuff. There'd be a lot we could do with it.
Yes, it would be a treasure trove, honestly.
Yep.
Because he did a similar thing for like 97 WWF for kayfabe commentaries, and it was phenomenal.
Yeah. Yep. There's a lot out there, that Jim has talked about on those shoot interviews about Smokey, but I think it'd be cool to pull it all together into some type of book.
Right. It would be really cool to do that. Let's talk about your great Facebook page and Twitter page here for a second. You try to update it every day.
Yeah, it started out as just a collection of clips that I got from Dick Steinborn, somewhere from about the Dick Steinborn and his dad, and then I started adding a lot more of my stuff from my own files, and over time I just changed the name of it to the Crowbar Press Archives, and I present each day. I try and present a new newspaper write-up, article, ad that's interesting and something different than what you usually read. When you read about pro wrestling in magazines or books. This is more things like wrestlers being arrested for one thing or another, fans rioting at the arenas, fans having heart attacks during the wrestling matches because they get so excited. All kinds of things like that most people have never ever seen. And I've got, thousands and thousands of newspaper articles about things like that are really interesting. And I just try and add to that page every single day, so that people every morning, they've got something new to read about the past in pro wrestling. Twitter, I did start a Twitter account about a year and a half ago, and I think I got posted a few things and haven't done anything since then.
But there are some great Twitter accounts out there that do post. Great.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's all right. Go ahead.
Sorry, I said there are great Twitter accounts that do post things.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had more time to do it on Twitter, but it's pretty much with my writing. I'm writing every day. I'm up at 4 or 5 in the morning. I'm busy working on books from time I get up until 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I mean, my wife and I will go. When we could go out, we'll go out and eat, or we do things with grandkids when we can. But if we're not doing something, watching television together or movies or something like that, then I'm here at the front of my computer working on my books. I mean, that's what I live for. I love it.
Yes. So I basically plugged your whole website. So, crowbarpress.com is where you can find everything. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Everything's right there on that front page, and I got tons of stuff to add that I'll be. And I got a lot of new posters. I just haven't had time to put online. I've got a lot of videos, probably 50 videos DVDs that I haven't put up there yet of things like old house shows that most people have never seen, that have never been available before. I've got a lot of that coming, and I'm also working on. I'm backing off of the autobiographies because I just don't. Some of them I really enjoy. Some I'd much rather be sitting in front of my files and researching things like Knoxville history. That's what I love doing, or Amarillo history, or whatever, Tampa. I love doing that, digging and finding these little nuggets of information that people have never heard, that have never been told before. That's what I enjoy more than anything. But I do have a few autobiographies in the works that I had already planned to do several, quite a while ago. The first out will probably be Frankie Kane. I've got a 2-volume set coming on. Frankie was one of the masked infernos in the 60s, and he also wrestled as a great Mephisto in the 70s into the 80s. And he is a phenomenal storyteller. And I'm going to present it in interview fashion, just like my old Whatever Happened To magazines, rather than try and rewrite it and make it sound as if he's writing a book. It comes across so much better. I love my interviews because when you read something in an interview format, I ask a question and it makes the reader feel like they're asking the question and that they're sitting across the table from the wrestler as he tells their story, rather than as opposed to sitting there reading a wrestler's story told on paper. It's just a more personal feel to it. So that's how Frankie's book's going to be. I'm also working on books with Joel Goodhart, who promoted the original ECW wrestling up in Philadelphia. Or it wasn't ECW, but it was what led to ECW. Yes, that's it. And then another book is with Burt Prentice, the promoter who promotes regularly in Jackson, Tennessee. I've done quite a bit of interview work with both Joel and Burt, and the main thing right now I've got to do is get them typed up. That's the hardest thing. I just don't have time to do the transcriptions, but I'm in the process of finding somebody. Somebody right now has offered to help me with some of that. So as soon as that starts happening, then I'll be turning these books out pretty quickly.
Yep. Thank you, Scott, for coming on today.
Well, sure. Thank you for asking me. I really appreciate it. I love doing these.
I really appreciate you coming on, and for Scott Teal, this was Danny Kukla, and that was Getting the Ring.